Well, if I move slowly tonight, I'll try not to, but it's because I did some hiking up at Sequoia today, so it was really nice up there until I got up into Mora Rock, and then the clouds were settled in. Good thing I've seen that view before, because you do all those steps. I can't believe how many steps there are in a quarter mile, and my goal was to get it done fast today, so I was up and back in 17 minutes, and I was feeling it, but that's because there was no view at the top to reward. You know, usually the hike is you get up to the top and, look around and, okay, see the clouds in me. So I'm glad that when we get to heaven, we're not just floating around in clouds, because I didn't see a whole lot of action up there. But I did get a good workout. I did do the Grove of Trees, the General Sherman route today, and that was fun. Got to see some beauty. And just refreshing. I had I usually take my prayer list when I have a long drive and I'm spending time with the Lord. So even time on the road is not wasted. Not that you care about all that, but anyway, that's what I did today. All right, we're going to go to 2 Kings 6 and then Genesis 37. Two places tonight. And I'll give you a little background to this. Genesis 37 and 2 Kings 6. It was 2018. My daughter was not married yet, but she was very interested in a young man from Tampa, and we happened to be parked at his home church. My son-in-law now, Andrew Spence, his pastor was a friend of mine from college, Brother Dave Goforth. And the church is Providence Baptist of Riverview, Florida, right outside Tampa. So we're there on a Wednesday night, and Wednesday night is prayer meeting. And so Brother Goforth does a Bible study first, and then they break up for prayer time, and they have the teenagers pray with different adults. So before we broke up for prayer, the pastor had been doing a series from the books of 1 and 2 Kings. And the night I was there, he preached one from Elisha, and it's phenomenal. We'll look at the passage in a minute. And it's where Elisha has been telling the king of Israel where the king of Syria plans to attack. The king of Syria finds out. He's incensed by the whole thing. So he dispatches his army and says, I want you to bring that guy to me. Elisha's servant goes out one morning and the hillside is full of soldiers, Syrian soldiers. And I don't know exactly what he was doing, probably gathering firewood or water or whatever. So you can imagine he drops the wood or the water, whatever it is, and he goes back in and says, Master, how shall we do? In other words, we're in trouble. And Elisha prays, Lord, open his eyes. And so the servant sees that behind the soldiers of the Syrian army are chariots of fire, an angelic host. And then the army comes down to invade where Elisha is at the time. And Elisha says, Lord, smite these people with blindness. And all of a sudden they go blind, the whole army. And he says, the man you're looking for is not here. The man you're looking for is the one talking to him. He's the man you're looking for is not here. But you follow me and I'll take you to the one you're looking for. And he leads them right to Samaria, the capital of northern Israel at the time. And then he prays, okay, Lord, open their eyes. And when they open their eyes, they realize we are done. They're all right in the middle of this walled city of Samaria. It's an amazing account. And I thought, man, that's incredible. I'm going to have to preach on that sometime, which I am tonight. So that all happened in a town called Dothan in the Bible. Well, we go to prayer meeting. And I'm paired up with a man that I had preached for many times. He's a retired pastor. His name's Glenn Mormon. And so I'm praying with a Mormon that night. And so Glenn Mormon has been a pastor, and now he's back in his home church. And he said, as we're about ready to pray, he said, Brother Rich, that was a really good message tonight, wasn't it? I said, yes, sir. I'm planning to preach that passage. It was so good. He said, do you know what's interesting to me? That was not the only significant event that happened at Dothan. Do you know what else happened at Dothan in the Bible? I thought for a minute. I said, Brother Mormon, I'd be lying if I said I did. He said it was at Dothan that Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. Isn't that amazing? One guy gets a heavenly escort by angelic beings out of trouble. The other one gets betrayed by his own flesh and blood into trouble. But in both cases, God was in perfect control. I thought, wow. Now I got to preach on that. And that brewed in my mind for a while, and I put together the message I want to give you tonight. I found out many people believe the word Dothan is from a Hebrew word meaning two wells, like a well of water, two wells. So I've called the message tonight, Two Roads Out of the City of Two Wells. Two roads out of the city of two wells. And let me tell you why I'm going to preach this tonight. This seems like kind of maybe a different revival type message. I'll tell you why I got burdened about it. One of Satan's chief agendas is to drive a wedge between you and your God, between me and God. He wants to drive a wedge between you. You know how he does that? He wants you to put God on trial and judge God to be guilty. Well, God isn't good. If God was good, this couldn't happen. Well, if God really cared, this wouldn't happen. And I want to tell you, I've been burdened more and more. If we're going to see revival, we've got to come around to a right concept of God, a right trust in Him. There's never going to be revival if we don't trust our Heavenly Father. And that's the motivating factor behind the message tonight. So 2 roads out of the city of 2 wells. Let's go to the original text that I was mentioning there, 2 Kings chapter 6, and it is an amazing account. 2 simple points tonight. I'll start with this. We'll look at Elisha first. Number 1, Elisha escorted out from his enemies by an army of angels. Escorted out from his enemies by an army of angels. It's in 2 Kings chapter 6, and I'm going to begin the reading in verse 8, if you follow me there. 2 Kings 6, verse 8. Then the king of Syria warred against Israel, took counsel with his servants, saying, in such and such a place shall be my camp. The man of God said to the king of Israel, or sent to the king of Israel, saying, beware that thou pass not such a place, for thither, at that spot, the Syrians are come down. The king of Israel sent to the place which the man of God had told him and warned him of, and saved himself there not once or twice. Now that saying there, not once or twice, that's an idiomatic expression. Talk about an understatement. It means repeatedly. Okay, this didn't just happen as an isolated incident. Not once or twice. I mean, this happened a lot. Verse 11. Therefore the heart of the king of Syria was sore troubled. He is severely disturbed for this thing. And he called his servants and said to them, will you not show me which of us is for the king of Israel? And one of his servants said, none, my lord, O king, but Elisha, the prophet that is in Israel, telleth the king of Israel the words that thou speakest in thy bedchamber. Now it's interesting. I don't know how this guy knew it, but he was point on. He was on point, spot on. He said, you know the words you speak privately in your bedroom? Elisha knows it, and he's telling his king. Verse 13. And he said, go and spy where he is, that I may send and fetch him. And it was told, saying, behold, he is in Dothan. Therefore he sent hither horses and chariots and a great host. They came by night and compassed the city about. Okay, the word compassed. Kids, remind me, in school, if you use a compass, you got a point in one end, a pencil in the other end. So when you draw with a compass, what shape do you get? Circle, yeah. So when it says he compassed the city, that means he encircled the city. He camped around the city. Okay, so he compassed the city. Let's see, where did we leave off there? And verse 15. And when the servant of the man of God was risen up early and gone forth, behold, a host compassed the city, both with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, alas, my master, how shall we do? In other words, he's like, we're in trouble. And he answered, fear not, for they that be with us are more than they that be with them. And Elisha prayed and said, Lord, I pray thee, open his eyes that he may see. The Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. Behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire round about Elisha. And when they had come down to him, Elisha prayed to the Lord and said, smite this people, I pray thee, with blindness. And he smote them with blindness, according to the word of Elisha. And Elisha said to them, this is not the way, neither is this the city. Follow me, I'll bring you to the man whom you seek. But he led them to Samaria. It came to pass, when they were come to Samaria, Elisha said, Lord, open the eyes of these men, that they may see. And the Lord opened the eyes, and their eyes, and they saw, and behold, they were in the midst of Samaria. And the king of Israel said to Elisha, when he saw them, my father, shall I smite them? Shall I smite them? He answered, thou shalt not smite them. Wouldest thou smite those whom thou hadst taken captive with a sword and with the bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master. And he prepared great provision for them, and when they had eaten and drunk, he sent them away. They went to their master. So the bands of bands of Syria came no more into the land of Israel. Okay, amazing account. So what happens here? Well, Elisha keeps telling the king of Israel, okay, king of Syria is planning to come after us, and here are the coordinates. He's going to attack right here. How does he know that? God's telling him. And this happens repeatedly, and finally the king of Syria said, okay, there's got to be a mole among us. There's got to be a spy. Who's tipping our hand? And one of his servants, again, I don't know how he knows, says, oh, it's none of us. It's Elisha, the prophet that's in Israel. How did he know that? I don't know. But he was right. And so the king of Syria says, I want that guy Elisha. He's messing up my plans. So send the whole army. Okay, you figure a whole army to take one man. That ought to go pretty well, right? So they go and they find out he's in the city of Dothan. And so they surround the whole city. And when the servant goes out that morning, I can imagine, he's gathering the wood and he's getting the water, and all of a sudden he looks up and, uh-oh. Picture him drop the wood, spill the water, run in, Master Elisha, we're in trouble. Now imagine this, I imagine, okay, right now war in Ukraine is going on. Can you imagine being a Ukrainian person and coming out one day and you find your whole city, let's say you're in Kiev, your whole city is surrounded by tanks and, armed guys, and you're thinking, oh, this is not good. So that's what's going through the servant's heart. And what does Elisha say? Fear not. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. What? And he says this, they that be with us are more than they be with them. In other words, I've done the calculation. We got more firepower than they do. How did Elisha know that? Do you think Elisha saw the chariots of fire and angels around the city? I don't. I don't think there's any indication that he said, well, how did he know? He just had walked with God so long, he knew God has this. See, 2 Corinthians 5:7 tells us we walk by faith, not by sight. Yeah, we walk by faith, not by sight. What a lesson. Those who have a history of walking with God, those who have a history of meditating in His Word day in and day out, they will be sustained in the deepest times of trouble. And it's a lesson for all of us. And you can't make up for, lost devotional time when the crisis hits, when you find out somebody in the family's got cancer or some tragic news comes. We got a saying around our house, trials in life are not electives, they are core curriculum. What does that mean? Well, when I went to college, there were certain classes that were core curriculum. You had to take these classes, and then others were electives. I took things like tennis and soccer. Those were electives. Who wouldn't? That's fun stuff, right? But I had classes because of the college I went to as a liberal arts college, so even though I was in a Bible program, I also had to take stuff like history of civilization and vice and affliction. Well, it was actually called voice and diction, but we called it vice and affliction. And I would have never signed up for history of civ or vice and affliction. But guess what I use all the time? I use history in my preaching. I certainly need to know how to articulate. Man, I grew up in New Jersey. Can you? Not only do I talk fast, but if I talk like where I grew up, hey, how you doing? Have you just met my daughters? You want a glass of water? So if I never shed my New Jersey trappings, some of you would be like, who is this guy? So believe me, my core curriculum classes really did serve a benefit. In life, trials are not electives. They're part of the core curriculum. We're going to go through them. We don't all have the same trials. But Job 5:7 says, man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. Okay, if you're doing s'mores with the kids, and you're putting your marshmallow in the fire and you poke the stick, and which way do sparks go? They go up. Hot air rises, right? As surely as hot air rises, as sparks go upward, people are going to have trouble. Psalm 34:19 says, many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth them out of them all. He didn't say it'd be an isolated thing. He said, many. In fact, 1 Peter 4:12 says, think it not strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened unto you, but rejoice inasmuch as you're partakers of Christ's sufferings. I think of the trials, and my heart goes out to Josh and Katie. I was in Casper a month ago with Brother Matney, and Josh and I were sitting outside, and what they're going through with their little Lene. And as Josh and I talked, I said, I don't know anybody in ministry who hasn't been through some type of heart-rending trial. I think one of the reasons is, and I don't know if I have all the answers, 2 Corinthians 1, verses 3 and 4, blessed be God, even the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies, the God of all comfort, who comforteth us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort them which are in any trouble by the comfort wherewith we ourselves are comforted of God. You can't learn compassion from a book. You only learn it by going through the fire of affliction. And I think about in our own lives, when in the year 2000, my pastor's wife shot and killed their 24-year-old daughter, then turned the pistol on herself and took her own life. Whew. I had no way to be prepared for that. God sustained us. That was in 2000. In 2003, Angela and I lost a third child, what would have been between Heather and Lene, our youngest. Turned out, we didn't know till we lost the baby, it was a boy, the only boy we would have, 17 weeks into term, and Angela went into preterm labor and gave stillbirth to a little baby boy. I was away too. I was up preaching. It was Easter of 2003, and I'm not even there with my wife in the deepest trial she's ever been through. That was not easy. But I will tell you this, grace sustains you. In 2008, 5 years later, Angela and I are planning to go on a cruise to Alaska with some friends of ours, and it's our 15th anniversary. And 2 nights before we leave, I get a call from my sister and said, "Rich, we lost Dad tonight." I said, "Lost Dad?" I'm thinking, silver alert, what do you mean, lost Dad? She said, "Dad died." What? He was only 65 years old. Not only was I not going to Alaska for a cruise, I was going back to New Jersey. Although my parents lived in Florida, their plot was in New Jersey, and I was going back to New Jersey to conduct a funeral for my own dad. 2 years later, no, I'm sorry, that was in 2008. 2012, 4 years later, we're coming out to California for a crisis. My sister-in-law, Sonia, married a fellow in the Navy, and they were in Monterey, and linguistics school there, and my sister-in-law was battling breast cancer, and at age 34 passed away. I want to tell you, between 2000 and 2012, we just went through one trial after another. Now, I'm not complaining to you. I will tell you this. I believe I can speak for Angela. We love the Lord more than we ever have. But it doesn't mean things are easy. I'll tell you this. You never come through a trial the same. Trials will change you. You'll either be better or you'll get bitter. But you'll never stay the same when trials come. And what's the key? The key is God's grace. So, here's Elisha, escorted out from his enemies by an army of angels. He tells the guys, "Hey, Lord, please blind them." Now, you got to know the army's never been blind before. They wouldn't be in the army if they were blind. Okay, you got to see to be an infantryman. So none of them had been blind before. He says, "Hey, I'll lead you where you need to go." So imagine the panic that they're in. And if they've never been blind, they're not used to functioning without sight. So he says, I'll lead you to the place. From Dothan to Samaria is 12 miles. Okay, 12 miles doesn't seem that long, but first of all, try walking 12 miles in the heat of the day, and then try doing it blind when you've not been blind. So I'm guessing everybody's got his hand in front of the guy on the shoulder in front of him, and how long does that take? Normally I walk a leisurely pace when I'm walking and praying, and I'll do, 3 miles an hour, a mile every 20 minutes, okay? That's just a normal walk. It's 3 miles an hour. How long does it take when you got a whole band of guys who are blind? This is an all-day endeavor. So they finally get into the walls of the city of Samaria, and then the gate shuts behind them, and the king of Israel's got to be thinking, this has never been easier to conquer an army. And Elisha says, "Okay, Lord, now will you open their eyes?" Notice there's a lot of opening and shutting of eyes here. "Lord, open my servant's eyes. Lord, please blind the army's eyes." Okay, Lord, open the army's eyes now. I mean, man. And only God has the power to give sight and take sight. And so when the eyes of the army are open, they're like, "Oh no, we're right in the capital city of Israel." And the king of Israel says, "Do I kill him now? Do I kill him?" Elisha says, "No, you don't kill him. If you'd taken them in battle, what would you do?" And see, this is what separates barbaric countries from countries that put a value on life. This is one of the things that I'm so grateful that our country has a history of treating life as valuable. Historically, we don't torture our enemies. We don't starve our enemies. And where do we get that? We got that from the Bible. He says, "No, you wouldn't. You don't torture them. You don't kill them. You give them food, and then you send them back." And what happens? They go back and think, "Whew, somehow we got out of that." And they don't come back for some long time after that. Amazing account. Everybody would love that kind of miraculous outcome. So I just heard that on a Wednesday night message, and now we're splitting up in groups of 3 and 4 to pray, and Brother Mormon says to me, boy, that was a good message from our pastor tonight. He said, Brother Rich, you know what else happened at Dothan, don't you? I said, no, I'd be lying if I did. He said, Dothan is the same place where Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. Not everybody gets an escort by a band of angels out of trouble. And that led me to dive into that text. It's Genesis 37. I want you to go there with me, the second of the 2 points tonight. Joseph, betrayed by his brothers to enslavement in Egypt. Joseph, betrayed by his brothers to enslavement in Egypt. Genesis 37, pick up in verse 12, if you will. Genesis 37, verse 12 is where this account starts. His brethren went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. Israel said to Joseph, do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, I'll send thee to them. He said to him, here am I. He said to him, go, I pray thee, and see whether it be well with thy brethren, well with the flocks. Bring me word again. So he sent him to out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Now, you're reading, okay, he went from this place to that place. Let me just put a little reality check in here. From Hebron, where they were living, to Shechem is 55 miles. Now, let me tell you, normally 55 miles for us, you can drive that in an hour, right? Some of these teenagers drive in a half hour. Okay, so now, today I went to the park, and it was only like, I forget, 60 miles or whatever to where I was going, but it was going to take me 2 hours because you get all those switchbacks. Okay, think about this. He's going to walk. Most likely, that's how everybody got where they went, unless they rode an animal. He's probably going to walk this 55 miles. It's like, okay, Dad, I'll go check on him. Verse 15, a certain man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field, and the man asked him, saying, what seekest thou? He said, I seek my brethren. Tell me, I pray thee, where they feed their flock. Now, you got to be thinking, okay, this is a complete stranger who meets Joseph, and he says, what are you looking for? Oh, I'm looking for my brothers. They're all from out of town. And what does he say? Verse 17. He said, oh, they're departed hence. For I heard them say, let us go to, notice where they went, Dothan. What's the chance this guy knows the brothers? Well, let's think of this. There are 10 of them, and they're all from out of town, and they're all watching their sheep. That was not unusual. They'd bring sheep to where the good pasture land was. And he says, oh yeah, those 10 guys from Hebron. Yeah, I heard them talk. They just happens to say, I heard them talk. And he said, yeah, they've gone on to Shechem, or to Dothan. So verse 17 says, Joseph went after his brethren and found them in Dothan. Okay, now that's another 12 miles. Now again, 12 miles doesn't seem like any big deal, but think about it when you're walking. This kid has spent days going to find his brothers. It would have been real easy for Joseph, who's 17 years old at this point, would have been real easy for him to go back home and say, hey, Dad, I tried, but I got there and they weren't there. And who's going to check on him, right? It was true. When he got there, they weren't there. Would have been real easy for Joseph to go back home and say, I tried. Nope, Dad gave me a job. You will find this about Joseph. In every circumstance in his life, he was a man of impeccable integrity. Even when he was forced into slavery, he worked to make everybody above him successful. That's an amazing trait. Most people are in it for themselves nowadays. In fact, it's interesting. The book of Ephesians tells us that we're not to do our work with eye service as men pleasers. You know what eye service is? That's where you're only doing what you're doing if the boss is watching you. You ever go into fast food and all these kids are on their phone, all of a sudden the general manager walks in, everybody's got a mop and they're cleaning up everything, and that's eye service, okay? They know somebody's watching, so I better get with it. Okay, Joseph did not do eye service. He knew that the eyes of the Lord are in every place, beholding the evil and the good. That'd be a good thing for you and me to recognize too. So he goes off to check on his brothers. Verse 18, when they saw him afar off, even before he came near to them, they conspired against him to slay him. What? Okay, some of you may feel like you live in a dysfunctional family. Don't most people? Okay, but think about this. His 10 brothers literally are plotting to murder him. Whoa. Verse 19, they said one to another, behold, this dreamer cometh. Okay, there's a history here. You remember when his dad gave him his coat of many colors? All right, that triggered him, first of all, because favoritism. Back then, you got to remember, most clothing was drab in color, because if you make clothing out of wool or linen or whatever, it's just, either white or tan or gray, or it's kind of bland, right? But the wealthy people would take dye, like there was a cloth called purple, and they would take this little shellfish out of the Mediterranean Sea, and they would crush the shellfish. It would create this purple pigment, and that was called purple cloth. They would dye the cloth, and the rich people would have nice clothing. Well, Joseph, man, he's got his multicolored coat. And so already they're like, number 11's the favorite, right? Remember, he had 12 sons when Benjamin came along. But 11 was the favorite because that was from his wife Rachel. So then he has the audacity to share with them these dreams. He said, I had these dreams, and my dreams were, there were 12, there were the sun, moon, and 12 stars, and all of your stars bowed down to my stars. And they're like, over our dead body, right? And then he has dreams of these bushels of corn, and everybody's bushel bows down to his. Now, I don't know that he told them to be braggadocious. He's just, I don't know his motive. But whatever his motive was, they hated him for it. Behold, this dreamer cometh. Look at verse 20. Come now, therefore, let us slay him. Okay, we're going to murder him. Cast him into some pit. We'll say, some evil beast that devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. And Reuben heard it. He delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. Reuben's the oldest, so he's doing something responsible here. Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit that's in the wilderness. Lay no hand upon him, that he might rid them out of their hands to deliver them to his father again. It came to pass when Joseph was come to his brethren that they stripped Joseph out of his coat of many colors that was on him. They took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Now this is interesting. Okay, so whatever this pit was, they're in Dothan. I wondered, why was Dothan called City of Two Wells? Well, the pit he gets cast into here normally had water, but it had gone dry. They would call him a cistern or a well. Evidently, the city well had gone dry, so that would lead me to believe that's why they had to dig another well. Isn't that intriguing? The place that should have been giving life became the place that was imprisoning. God created you with desires that He wants to justly satisfy. Desires for a right marriage, desires for food. Isn't it a blessing that we were created with taste buds? Desire for satisfaction and fulfillment. But many people's desires become the tomb of their soul. They become enslaved to desires. Some become obsessed with food, and some with sex, and some with drugs, and whatever your desire may be. I want to warn you, Satan knows how to take your desire and mine and use them against us. That's why the Bible says, let him that thinketh he standeth take heed lest he fall. The very place that should have been life-sustaining now becomes life-imprisoning. So he gets thrown into this pit. Verse 24, they took him and cast him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Verse 25, and they sat down to eat bread, and they lifted up their eyes, and looked, behold, a company of Ishmaelites came from Gilead with their camels, bearing spicery, balm, myrrh, going to carry it down to Egypt. Judah said to his brethren, what profit is if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. Let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brethren were content. There passed by Midianites, merchantmen, and they drew and lifted up Joseph out of the pit, sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. Reuben returned to the pit. Behold, Joseph was not in the pit, and he rent his clothes. Apparently, Reuben was not there when this transaction occurred. And he returned to his brethren and said, the child is not, and whither shall I go? And I, whither shall I go? And they took Joseph's coat and killed a kid of the goats and dipped the coat in blood. Now think about what they're doing here. They're creating an alibi. They don't want to be found guilty, so they've got to create some excuse of innocence. So they kill an animal, innocent animal dies, and they dip Joseph's coat in the blood, and then they send it back to their dad. Notice 32. They sent the coat of many colors, and they brought it to their father and said, this have we found. Know now whether it be thy son's coat or no. So in other words, they didn't take it themselves. They sent a messenger to their father, because that would avoid all the questions, and they would lead their dad to come to his own conclusions. And what do you think Jacob thought when he saw that coat? I can imagine he broke out in wailing and mourning. In fact, if you read verse 34, Jacob rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his loins, and he mourned for his son many days. Oh, verse 33, I skipped. It's my son's coat. No doubt an evil beast had devoured him. Joseph is without doubt rent in pieces. In other words, he's left to conclude exactly what the brothers want him to conclude. Yeah, old Joe never made it up there. Joseph was traveling, and evidently he got attacked, and poor kid, this is all that's left of him, coat of many colors. That's not at all what happened, but that's what they leave their dad to believe. And think about this, for the next years that go by, Jacob is left to mourn his son's death, thinking that it was his fault. I should have never sent the kid. If I hadn't sent him to look out for his brothers, this never would have happened. Well, what you think happened did not happen. I wonder how many times we live our lives with false guilt. Guilt over things that we had no control. And I wonder sometimes maybe based on conclusions that are really not accurate conclusions. And so you read on in verse 35, his sons and his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. He said, I'll go down to my grave unto my son mourning. Thus his father wept for him. The Midianites sold him into Egypt unto Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. Now I think you know what happens. He goes into Egypt, and Potiphar buys Joseph. And Potiphar is an officer of the guard. And he has Joseph enslaved, and Joseph proves to be such a trustworthy man that Potiphar eventually says, you know what? My whole household affair is under Joseph's custody. He's going to look after the money. He's going to look after the running of this household. He so trusted him. Isn't that amazing? It's intriguing to me that you never find one shred of evidence of bitterness in Joseph's life. You think about it. If Joseph were the typical teenager, what would his attitude have been? Some God we serve in Israel. I go to do my dad's bidding, and now my dad thinks I'm dead. I heard what my brother said, and now I get sold into Egypt, and I'm a slave. Like, where's God in all this? Is that Joseph's attitude? Never. Never. Think about it. He doesn't own one page of the Bible. Hasn't been written yet. We're living in the book of Genesis here. He has no preacher. He doesn't have his parents for counsel. His own brothers have turned on him. Nobody knows where he is. And in all that, there's never a word of bitterness or resentment in Joseph's life. In fact, what happens? While he's in Potiphar's house, Potiphar so trusts him, but Potiphar's wife, she sees an opportunity. Now, you got to understand, okay, sometimes we read these stories and we kind of make them clinical, like, oh, she must have been some old haggard woman. I don't think so. See, because in Egypt, the movers and shakers, they were they'd be like the Hollywood crowd. Okay, they're all into glitz and glamour and impressing people, and I wouldn't be surprised if she's some trophy wife, and now she sees this guy and says, wow, he's a fine specimen of a man, and she thinks, my husband's kind of on the decline, and I'd like to get that guy, and she literally tries to entice him into an illicit relationship. Come lie with me. The kid's 17 years old. With all the battle of desires and conflicted thinking that's going on in his mind, and how easy it would have been for him to think, well, you know what? God abandoned me, my brothers turned on me. At least I might have some kind of pleasure in this world. Would have been easy to think that. What did he say? He told Potiphar's wife, how can I do this evil, and this great evil, he said, this great evil and sin against God? She doesn't even acknowledge the God of Israel. Yeah, but he does. And one day when he goes into, the Bible tells us she tried this repeatedly. This wasn't a one-time thing. She's constantly trying to entice him. One day he goes into the house to take care of business, and she grabs a hold of his coat. It's amazing how many times the coat of Joseph comes into play. She grabs a hold of his coat. It's not the multicolored coat now. It's the Egyptian coat. And she says, come lie with me. And he's like, no way. And he flees, and she literally rips the coat off his body. And for a second time, he gets framed, or, somebody else has led to wrong conclusions. She goes in and says to the other servants, look at this. Your master brought in a Hebrew to mock us. He tried to rape me. That would be her insinuation. Is that true? That is the direct opposite of the truth. Notice how many times Joseph is framed in such a way it's directly opposite of what's true. Boy, that's the way Satan operates, folks. You can be sure of this. Satan's goal is to steal, kill, and destroy. John 10, verse 10. In fact, the Bible tells us he's a liar and the father of lies. So, you know what happens? Potiphar has Joseph thrown into prison. Now, that's interesting. Why didn't he have him killed? If he thought a Hebrew slave property tried to rape his wife, he would have had legal grounds to have him killed. I kind of have the feeling that Potiphar didn't believe his wife's story. But he can't admit that because otherwise it's a reflection on him. So he's got to save face somehow. So he gets him thrown in prison. It's very likely that Potiphar was in charge of the prison because he was called captain of the guard. And so Joseph gets turned over to this jailkeeper. But interestingly, it's almost like somebody told the jailkeeper, hey, this is a good guy, so give him a chance. Because the next thing you know, Joseph's in charge of everything in the prison. Everywhere Joseph goes, he ends up to be the top dog. He's in prison, he's in charge of everything. And you remember, he's there for some long time. And then after a while, 2 of Pharaoh's officers get put in prison, the butler and the baker. I don't know what happened to the candlestick maker, but the butler and the baker got put in prison. And they both have dreams, and they are stressed out by these dreams. And Joseph said, well, listen, there's a God in heaven who can interpret dreams. What are your dreams? And so the butler tells him, he says, I had this dream, and this is why. He said, oh, your dream means in 3 days, your head will be restored to Pharaoh's court. You'll be lifted out of here and restored. And the baker says, oh, what about my dream? I was carrying this basket of bread, and all of a sudden the birds came and ate the bread. And he said, yeah, yours is not so good. In 3 days, your head's going to be lifted off your body. So apparently he was the guilty one, and he ends up beheaded. And the butler goes back to Pharaoh's court, and Joseph says, hey, listen, would you do me a favor? Look, I'm here on false charges, and my brother sold me into slavery, and then Potiphar's wife turned on me, and would you just bring my case before Pharaoh? And the butler says, oh yeah, man, I'll tell him. And he forgets. 2 years go by. And one day Pharaoh has a dream. And Pharaoh has a dream that's so stressful, he is demanding, tell me what this dream means. And the butler says, oh, now I remember my sin. There's a Hebrew in the jail. He can tell you. And Pharaoh's so desperate, like, bring him in. And you remember, it's the fat cows get eaten up by the lean cows, and it's the fat bushels get swallowed up by the lean bushels. And Pharaoh says, what in the world does it mean? And Joseph says, well, see, God's tipping you off what he's going to do here. You're going to have 7 years of real plenty. You're going to have such abundance of crops. You talk about bellwether crops, but the problem is it's going to be followed by 7 years of famine that's so severe, everything prior to that is just going to be exhausted. And if you're smart, you'll appoint somebody to start stockpiling now for the lean times. And Pharaoh said, who could be smarter than this man? And he makes Joseph the viceroy, in other words, the governor of Egypt. Joseph becomes the most powerful man in Egypt beside Pharaoh himself. You know what's amazing? Joseph never candidated for office. The Bible says, when a man's ways please the Lord, he maketh even his enemies to be at peace with him. That's in Proverbs 16:7. Psalm 75 says, promotion cometh neither from the east, nor the west, nor the south, but the Lord is the judge. He setteth up one and putteth down another. Let God promote you. And man, did God promote Joseph. So, you know what happens. He spares the land from disaster. Well, of course, his own brothers are in the land of Hebron, and famine comes there, and they're desperate. They've got to come to Egypt. They said, we heard there's food in Egypt. And they come and they bow before somebody they don't even recognize. Well, he's now 30 years old. They sold him into slavery when he was 17. Think about how much change occurs between 17 and 30. Not to mention, he's speaking the Egyptian language, and it wouldn't surprise me if he's got one of those Egyptian haircuts. You know, they had that little sprig of a ponytail out the side with a shaved head on the side, and he doesn't look like any Hebrew when they meet him. They have no idea it's their brother, and they come in and bow before him, and he realizes who they are. And he says, why are you here? Speaking through an interpreter. We just need to buy grain. You're spies. You've come to spy out the nakedness of the land. No. We're 10 brothers. We're actually from a family of 12. One of our brothers is not, like the one they're talking to. One of our brothers is dead, Yeah, really, you're talking to him right now. And the other one's at home with our dad. He says, all right, we're going to find out if this is true. You bring that one from home, and then I'll know your story is true. And you remember how this whole thing plays out. He toys with him. And man, it would have been tempting to do more than toy with him. But let's go to chapter 45 of Genesis, and we'll wrap this up. So what happens? Finally, they go home, and he keeps Simeon, and they're supposed to bring Benjamin back, and their dad says, no way, Benjamin's not going back. And they said, Dad, we're not getting any grain if we don't bring Benjamin. Sorry, you're not getting Benjamin. So finally they run out of food, and their brother's still locked up in prison. Dad's like, sorry, not giving up my youngest. And they said, Dad, if we don't take him back, we're not getting any food. All right, just take him. But you make sure you come back. And chapter 45, notice what happens. Verse 1, then Joseph could not refrain himself before all them that stood by him. And he cried, cause every man to go out from me. And there stood no man with him, while Joseph made himself known to his brethren. He wept, he's crying. He wept aloud, and the Egyptians and the house of Pharaoh heard. And Joseph said to his brethren, I am Joseph. Doth my father yet live? His brethren could not answer him, for they were troubled at his presence. I thought, yeah, I bet. I mean, that's like the understatement of the Bible, right? They're troubled at his presence. Joseph said to his brethren, come near to me, I pray you. They came near. He said, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt. Now therefore be not grieved, nor angry with yourselves that you sold me hither. For God did send me before you to preserve life. For these 2 years hath famine been in the land, yet there are 5 years in the which there shall neither be earing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve you a posterity in the earth, to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you that sold me hither, but God. And he hath made me father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Whoa! What a revelation that must have been to the brothers. We'll see what will become of his dreams. Yeah, you did. You're bowing to him. And he's got your head in his hands. And amazingly, instead of heads rolling, grain's coming their way. He says, go bring Dad, because there are 5 more years of this, and you're going to just keep coming back to Egypt for food. You might as well all just come here, and I'll take care. And remember, 70 of them come there. The family grows to 70. And after that, they spend 400 plus years in Egypt. And when they go out with Moses, it's around 2 million people or so. Wow. So, I got thinking about that. One guy gets an escort by a fiery band of angels. The other gets sold by his brothers into slavery. And yet God was in control. I think it was G. Campbell Morgan who said, whenever you go through the furnace of affliction, you can know this: God's eye is always on the clock and his hand is on the thermostat. He knows how much heat you can take, and he knows how long you need to take it. I want to conclude by reading an amazing story. I was given this book by a pastor friend of mine about 2 years ago called Legacies of Light, and it's brief biographical sketches of some famous Christians, and I knew many of them. A.W. Tozour, Susanna Wesley, Oswald Chambers, Adoniram Judson, Fanny Crosby, Jim Elliot, Hudson Taylor, John Newton, Charles Spurgeon, George Mueller. I mean, I knew a lot of these names. But he opens his book with the name of 2 missionaries I never heard of, David and Svea Flood, S-V-E-A, Svea, Swedish couple. I thought, it's kind of interesting that he would open up a book with 2 people whose names I'd never heard. And then I read this story. Listen to this as we close. In 1921, David Flood and his young wife Svea and their little 2-year-old son left Sweden for the interior of Africa. They traveled with another missionary couple, the Ericsons. These 2 couples were active church members. They sang in the choir. Svea played the violin and was the church soloist. But they'd committed their lives to taking the gospel to the unreached tribes of Africa. They were filled with enthusiasm and optimism as they literally hacked their way through the mountains of the Congo, eager to begin their ministry at some yet undetermined, unreached village. To their surprise, however, one village after another refused them entrance, convinced that they would anger the village gods and bring great trouble upon the people. After days of carrying their own supplies, they were hungry and weak. They prayed as they reached yet another village on the side of a mountain that they would finally find rest and ministry opportunities. But the chief of that village was even more hostile than all the others. He demanded that they leave. They carried their supplies farther up the mountain and put up their tents. They were too weary to set out again, so they decided to clear the brush and build mud huts and do their best to reach these hostile villagers. During the next agonizing weeks, which turned into agonizing months, David and Svea Flood struggled to learn Swahili, and along with the Ericsons, they tried everything they could to reach out to the villagers below. The village chief only tightened his grip on the people. The people were prohibited from even visiting the missionaries except for one little boy. He was allowed to go up and sell them chickens and eggs. David was amazed at his wife's insistence that while they might never reach the village and probably never impact Africa, she could perhaps win this one child for Jesus Christ. Every time the boy visited the camp, she showered him with love and attention. And sure enough, one afternoon the other missionaries watched as Svea knelt with this little boy and led him in a prayer of repentance. The boy had to keep his decision for Christ a secret in the village, lest he not be allowed to return, or something worse. Eventually, the Ericsons decided to leave David, Svea, and their little boy and return to an established mission station many miles away. Even though the Flood family battled malaria and desperately crude conditions, they decided to stay. Sometime later, Svea announced that she was expecting their second child. She was already weak and struggling physically, and David feared the worst. It was too late to travel through the jungles of the Belgian Congo without risking her life and the life of their unborn child. The baby would be born in the mud hut on that mountain. The newly converted boy carried the news back to the village, and the chief, surprisingly, allowed one of the women to serve as a midwife. By the time the baby was due, Svea Flood was weak with malaria. When the African midwife arrived, Svea was groaning in pain and suffering from high fever. When the little girl was born, Svea whispered that she was to be called Aina, A-I-N-A, Aina, a classic name for Swedish girls. 17 days later, Svea Flood died. Hopeless and filled with bitter rage, David dug a crude grave for his 27-year-old wife. How could he possibly care for his young son, plus a sickly little baby girl, without assistance? He hired a young man from the village along with several others. He took his children down the mountain to the mission station. He was finished with the ministry, the gospel, and God. As far as he was concerned, God had taken the life of his faithful bride, and their ministry had been nothing less than a tragic waste. Returning to Sweden was a monumental task for David. He knew he had no one to feed or care for his baby girl. The Ericsons had been unable to have children, so David offered them the opportunity to adopt Aina. They were thrilled at the chance and agreed to do so. With that, David took his son and left the station, never to return. He never even looked back. Before Aina turned 1 year old, Joel and Bertha Ericson's food was poisoned by some unbelieving natives. They died within days of each other. Aina was once again without parents. But she was soon claimed by another missionary couple and raised as their own daughter. When she was 3 years old, Aina and her adoptive parents left the mission field of Africa for good and eventually settled in South Dakota. Her Swedish name was changed to Aggie. Aggie would later write that even as a young girl, she knew she was different. She would become known as the daughter of the missionary who died on the mountain, rescued by missionaries who were poisoned, and, as her biography title said, would become a girl without a country. Eventually, Aggie attended North Central Bible College in Minneapolis and married a godly young man who entered the ministry. Years went by. Aggie had no information about her father. She knew very little of her past. She knew her parents' names, of course, and that their homeland was Sweden, but that was about it. She hardly had time to think about it. With a husband and a family and a busy ministry, her husband, Dewey Hurst, had become president of a Bible college in Seattle, Washington. Then one day, unexpectedly, a Swedish religious magazine appeared in her mailbox. She had no idea who had sent it. She couldn't read the words. But as she turned the pages, one photograph arrested her attention. It was the picture of a small white cross planted in the earth over an obvious burial site, and on the cross was the name Svea Flood. She immediately took the magazine to a college professor who could translate the article. The professor translated as she read, telling how two missionaries pushing through the African jungle, camping at night, traveling by day, came across a village in the Belgian Congo and found the burial plot that they had photographed. They began to inquire and found out this was the grave of a missionary who had died shortly after giving birth to a baby girl. but not before leading one African boy to Christ. The woman's widowed husband had left their daughter in the hands of fellow missionaries. The article continued saying Svea Flood didn't live long enough to learn that that little African boy that they had won to Christ on the mountain in time went on to gain permission from the village chief to start and build a school. Gradually, this now mature young man, teacher and leader, taught the gospel of Christ, and all of his students came to trust in Jesus Christ as well. Then they evangelized their parents, and even the chief himself became a Christian. Now that village had 600 believers and an active church professing Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. All this came from the sacrifice and tears and the sowing of David and primarily Svea Flood. Aggie couldn't believe the news. She began to cry and thank God for letting her learn the truth of her parents and their sacrifice and the harvest of fruit. For their 25th wedding anniversary, the Bible College gave the Hurst a vacation to Sweden, where, among other things, Aggie could search for her father. It wasn't difficult to find his family. David Flood had remarried. He had 4 more children before his second wife also died. Now an old man, he was wasting away as an alcoholic, a professed agnostic who dared anyone to talk to him about God. After a joyous meeting with her half-brothers and half-sister, Aggie brought up the subject of seeing their father. Her siblings weren't too optimistic about the idea. Their father had become deeply bitter. He had little to do with any of them, and most of all, he hated God. They warned her that whenever he heard the name of God, he flew into a rage. Aggie was determined to see him. Eventually, she made it to his little apartment where the door was answered by a housekeeper. Inside the room, there were liquor bottles on every windowsill, and the table was covered with more bottles. And in the corner was a small, wrinkled old man lying on a rumpled bed, his head turned away. "Papa," she said tentatively. He turned and began to cry. "Aina, I never meant to give you away." "It's all right, Papa," she replied, taking him gently in her arms. "God took care of me." The man instantly stiffened. The tears stopped. "God forgot all of us. Our lives have been like this because of Him." He turned his face back to the wall. Aggie stroked his face and then continued, undaunted, "Papa, I've got a little story to tell you. It's a true one. You didn't go to Africa in vain. Mama didn't die in vain. That little boy you won to the Lord grew up to win that whole village to Jesus Christ. The one seed you planted just kept growing and growing. Today there are 600 African people serving the Lord because you were faithful to the call of God in your life. Papa, Jesus loves you. He has never hated you." The old man turned back to look into his daughter's eyes. His body relaxed. He began to talk. By the end of the afternoon, he had come back to the God that he had resented for so many years. Over the next few days, father and daughter enjoyed warm moments together. Aggie and her husband soon had to return to America. And within a few weeks, David Flood had gone into eternity. Let me give you an addendum to this remarkable story. A few years later, Aggie and her husband attended an evangelism conference in London. A report was given from the nation of Zaire, formerly the Belgian Congo, by the superintendent of the National Church Association he represented. National Church Association. He represented over 100,000 baptized believers. He spoke of the amazing spread of the gospel in Zaire. Afterward, Aggie rushed over to ask him if he had ever heard of her parents, David and Svea Flood. "Yes, ma'am," the man replied in French, his words being translated into English. "It was Svea Flood who led me to Jesus Christ. I was the boy who brought food to your parents before you were born. In fact, to this day, your mother's grave and her memory are honored by all of us." He embraced her in a long, sobbing hug. Then he continued, You must come to Africa. You must see. Your mother is the most famous person in our history." She agreed. After months of planning, Aggie and her husband made the long journey back to the place of her birth. They eventually arrived at the outpost where she had been given by her father to the Ericksons. This was the outpost where she had lived as a little toddler, playing in the dirt with her African friends, learning the Swahili language. There she visited the graves of her first adoptive parents. Then they drove several miles to the village where her parents had desperately tried to reach the villagers. Only this time, There were hundreds of villagers waving and cheering as she came into view. They had built arches covered with flowers to honor her reception. Eventually, the pastor of the church took her up to the hill, to a flat place beneath a grove of trees. This is where her parents' mud hut once stood. This is where she was born. He then pointed to a simple grave overlooking the valley below. Marking the grave was a small white cross, and on it was written, Svea Flood, 1896 to 1923. Aggie was standing where her mother had stood, declaring the gospel to one small boy. Now she knew the harvest seed of her mother. Later in church, with the believers of the village crowding around, the pastor read the words of Psalm 126, verse 5. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. 100,000 people who had identified with Christ in baptism, having been saved through one little boy. Some of you would know if I make reference to a radio personality, Paul Harvey, and now you know the rest of the story. You know, you and I have no idea what God's doing. You read it took a lifetime for all that to unravel. When David Flood became bitter and enraged at God, God never gave up on David Flood. And I want you to know He never gives up on you either. Whether you get delivered by an army of angels out of Dothan or sold from Dothan into slavery in Egypt, listen, God loves you and He cares about you. Don't let Satan drive a wedge between you and your Father. Two roads out of the city of two wells. We don't get to choose the road, but we can choose to trust. Let's bow our heads. Thanks. You listened really well.